The City Council is considering new protections for renters in Boston, especially people affected by the hot real estate market. The measure would apply mainly to owners of at least 7 units of property in Boston, but a group advocating for owners says the effect on the city's housing market could be more widespread. To explain is the executive director of the Small Property Owners Association, Skip Schloming. Thank you very much for being with us, Skip.
Thank you.
First of all, talk about who these owners are. I mean, we were there at the hearing on Monday. You had quite a few of them sitting in the galleries.
Sure, yeah. Well, there are a lot of owners of any size property, but their main concern is that this is a form of rent control, and we just don't want to get rent control back in Massachusetts at all. Our group is the one that in 1994 sponsored a statewide referendum that ended rent control in Massachusetts, and we want to preserve that victory.
Well, you're concerned about language in this ordinance, the Jim Brooks Stabilization Act, and I know most of the language is about establishing just cause for eviction or defining what that would be, but what is it that really makes you think this is going to be a return to rent control?
Well, it's clever what it does. It doesn't specifically go and set the rents for individual units through a city bureaucracy. But it does, by manipulating evictions, which will appear like it's not rent control, it manipulates them so they do become below market rents. And that's the definition of rent control in the 1994 referendum. It's any regulation that in any way requires below market rents, and that's including the regulation of evictions.
Well, you're talking about evictions. I assume that means if a property owner wants somebody to get out of there before a lease expires, or if there may be a tenant at will.
Right.
But on the other hand, if I buy a piece of property and I want to raise the rent and maybe fix up the building some more, I can go to the tenant and say, I'm sorry, your old lease is over. Here's the new lease. I know the rent's higher. You either take it or leave it. I mean, I can still do that, can't I?
No, not without consequences. Technically you're free to do it, but the consequences can be severe. One of the things that this program or proposal does is requires a renewal of a lease, which could include a rent increase. That's the most important issue here. Can be judged in court by a judge who can decide under the state's Consumer Protection Act whether or not the rent increase is fair or unfair and deceptive. And that there's no definition of what unfair or deceptive might be. But here's what the real problem is with that proposal. If the judge finally decides your rent increase is unfair, the punishment is quite severe. It's triple damages, which is 3 times the monthly rent, punitive damages, which is whatever the judge decides, and the tenant's attorney's fees, not to mention the fact that the owner also has to pay for his own attorney's fees. So with that kind of a punishment, owners are going to be very, very cautious about doing rent increases. And in fact, the law even pushes them to just freeze their rents or only do rents that the tenants will agree to voluntarily, which will obviously be just minimal rent increases. And here's how that works. The proposal would require that landlords, every time they do an eviction or a rent increase, have to give notice of this event to the city, and the city they have to do it within 48 hours. It's very strict, and within 5 days the city has to come back and give the tenant or the tenants involved a notice of their rights, including whether or not including the names of the tenant advocacy groups in the city and contact information. So it's putting a landlord's tenants right in contact with advocacy groups. And one of the worst things they can do is pick an owner and do a rent strike on them. In other words, organize the tenants in the whole building to stop paying rent, and the owner is just totally sunk. The owner has no money to mount multiple evictions against the tenants that are not paying their rent. So the owner will just say, just pay me. the rent you were paying before. Forget even the rent you haven't paid. Just pay me the rent you were paying before. And maybe even they could even force them to go below the previous rent.
Well, I looked at this ordinance several times, and there is language that's pretty clear to me that if I come up with a new lease and they don't want to sign on to it, see you later, and if they're not paying the rent, that's grounds for eviction. I mean, those are all pretty much in there.
Yeah, no, the form requires the tenant to agree to a new lease if it's exactly the same terms as the previous lease, and that would include the rent. So it's not possible for an owner to get away with putting a rent increase on a tenant, because every rent increase the notice has to go to the city, and then the city will come back. And the key problem with the possibility of rent strikes is that owners simply will be so afraid of that, they won't do anything that requires them to send the notice into the city.
But let's talk about, I know there are these big buildings where lots of poor people live, and there are investors who buy into that and they take the risk. But more commonly in Boston, you've got these, let's say, 3-deckers, and maybe somebody wants to buy a few 3-deckers and they live in one of them maybe. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't they just not even be covered by any of this at all? They wouldn't have to worry about it?
Well, no, they would. If the description that you just gave, an owner that has 2 triple-deckers and lives in a 2-family, will have 7 units, and the cutoff is between 6 and 7. If you're up to 6 units, you're exempt. 7 or more, you're on underneath it. And they keep saying, oh, this is just large landlords and big real estate companies, but that's not true. In our opinion, what's really important is whether the owner is managing and doing the repairs himself or herself. And that's what qualifies as a small owner in our definition, not by the number of units. But if you go by the units, somewhere between 7 and 20 units would come under this provision, but it would, because it's more than 7 units or 7 or more.
Come back to the consumer protection language here about unfair or deceptive rents. This is not language that's new. It's been around for a long time. It's on the books right now. Mm-hmm. So, and no one's been complaining about it. No one says this is rent control. So, how is this an issue? And couldn't you just tweak that to make it not an issue?
I don't think so. And landlords are one of the groups that get hit very hard with, it's called 93A, the state consumer protection law. And it gets hit against owners if they do anything to mishandle a security deposit. And the rules are very specific. You have to put it in a separate account, and you have to give the tenant notice of the account, and you have to give it back within 30 days, and you can only deduct things that you've actually spent money for or have a bid for. So if there's any mistake, if you didn't every year give the minimal interest that was earned on this monthly rent, which is dollars, you are guilty of violating the law, and you get triple damages, punitive damages, and the tenant's attorney's fees. So it hits landlords hard when that happens. And when landlords call me, I tell them, just give the whole security deposit back and eliminate the grounds for the lawsuit against you.
Aren't we in a very different climate as far as investing and taking risks in property in Boston, as opposed to the days of rent control, the 1960s and 1970s?
Well, the key thing is, what will this just cause eviction and a variety of rent control do to the market? And it will have the same effect now as it had back then. And that is, owners who have spent a lot in this hot market for property, 2 or 3 family, and gotten, had to spend quite a bit to get it, their mortgage requires them to pay very promptly and the full amount that's due. And if this goes into effect and tenants suddenly stop paying rent increases, they can lose their property very quickly, and they can just walk away from it, and it'll get boarded up by the city, and the city, it's a tremendous cost to just bulldoze it down, which is sometimes what will happen. And one boarded up building in a neighborhood ruins the whole neighborhood in terms of the value. And one of the things that's very serious for the city of Boston is that all of this housing that's affected, and I'm saying it's roughly 50% of all the rental units in the city, will be devalued. And that means the property taxes that will be generated by them to go to the city are going to be much lower. And as a consequence, the city will increase the property taxes on the non-controlled owners, which are single-family homeowners, many condo owners, and owners of 2- and 3-family properties primarily, especially if they occupy them.
Thank you very much for being with us.
You're quite welcome.
Skip Schloming from the Small Property Owners Association.